Welcome to the Inner Green Deal podcast. Can we expect a revolution from the young? In this first episode, I'm talking to Matthew Pye, author, philosophy teacher, and founder of a number of climate action initiatives. I asked Matthew about the role of the young and how their impact is evolving. This is a special episode, not just because it is the first in a new series, but because Matthew so clearly describes the benefits of the inner dimension of climate action. Why it pays to go beyond the rhetoric, and why uncovering the truth, not just the facts, but what we deep down feel to be right and truthful, is ultimately what makes a difference. It gives us the drive and the courage to confront and change. So be curious as Matthew shares this vision and kicks off the Inner Green Deal podcast. My name is Jeroen Jans, and thank you for joining us. So welcome, Matthew. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Yeah?
Nice to be here. Yeah.
So Matthew, you work at the European School, and also in your free time you work with teenagers and students. And so I'm really curious, what is your inspiration to work with young people?
Well, my first inspiration is philosophy. That's my job. I'm a philosophy teacher. And that subject asks these fantastic questions. You strip off the surface of life, you get down to the roots, you ask deep questions of yourself, of society, etc. And to do that with young people who are asking those questions. They're in the twilight zone between childhood and adulthood. They don't tolerate fluff. They want to really get to the bottom of things. That's a great job to have. I feel really privileged to have that, especially in a European school with that European setting. So that gets me out of bed. And I've been doing that here for 13 years. And in the last 8, 9, 10 years of that, that project has developed into an environmental thing. So those questions about meaning, identity, and so on have kind of opened up into questions about ecology and seeing beyond the surface of things in terms of society or politics or consumption, etc. So,
and how do you talked about the climate? So how do you see the young that you meet in school and other places? How do you see them responding to the current situation?
Well, it's indisputable, really, that students are suffering from a lot of eco-anxiety. Not all, of course, but many do. It's kind of a background noise to their life. But what happens when they really see what's happening, you can see this in Greta herself, Greta Thunberg, that you don't know what to do with that anxiety because you don't have a place to put it, because it's not recognized, like in terms of when you see how deep the stress marks go and how big the catastrophe is and how close it is, it's not recognized by the system. So, that's not recognized by the system out there in the world, but it's also not recognized by schools. Because if you want to be ecological in school, that generally means doing more recycling or plastics. So then you think, well, that's not enough. And so then there's this dissonance. So part of the ecological anxiety for us as educationalists, as teachers and so on, is to recognize and deal with that gap. So we had a well-being survey in school, which I think you're part of.
Yeah,
so,
right.
And in that survey, after tests, ecology was the second thing which came up as the thing which caused the most anxiety. Homeworks were third. So there is a lot of understanding out there by young people, and it's often not matched by the understanding of adults, which is shocking to them,
Yeah. How do you see the role of students then as they respond now, perhaps in the past? Because philosophy teacher, I'm sure you've looked at that. How do you see this evolving?
You're right. In terms of a historical survey, children have often had different identities, if you like. Before Rousseau, for example, they were kind of naughty. Of course, they're not naughty now, are they? And after Rousseau, there's this kind of a romanticization of childhood and so on. And then in the Industrial Revolution, they became kind of economically interesting. So education reflected that, and we made them numerate and literate and so on. So now we have all three sort of, I think, where we are now. And I think if you look at childhood now, I think everybody could really say, just with common sense, that there's been an invasion of childhood by the commercial world. For teenagers, I remember if I look now at music videos or something, that would have been considered pornographic 20 years ago, or, and I'm not being old fuddy-duddy now, but I think there has been an invasion of childhood by, especially through social media and electronic things like that. So in a way, children have become adults much faster. And that's, if you go back to what I said about ecological anxiety, in a way that's part of it. That the role of young people now, they're in a very difficult position because they have an adult understanding of what's going to happen.
Right.
It raises questions about the adult world and politics and business and so on. But they don't have any voice or any leverage to do anything about it. So we've kind of invaded their space, not just with the carbon budget, but with commercial interests. And so I think in terms of being a teacher and being in education, I see my role as providing them with a way of, first of all, getting a clear picture of what the reality is, and then giving them some tools to make autonomous responses to it that are constructive. So yeah, I think it's a tough time to be a child. If I think back to my teenage years, I didn't have any of these complications. I was like... Yeah. I was eating sweets and listening to music and
and I wonder, that's an interesting point you're making, and I wonder whether to a certain extent that explains the strong other reaction that we haven't talked about, is seeing them on the streets, seeing them being angry, upset, protesting, not going to school, and I wonder whether that's kind of the flip side of what you're just talking about.
Yeah, I've been doing this for, like I say, 9-10 years. And at the beginning, it was very difficult to talk about system change and systems collapses because it was so off the radar for anybody.
Right.
And so it was kind of really awkward as a teacher. And I had to constantly manage parental reactions, the management in my school, their reactions, because we were saying something that was so dissonant. It was as if we'd watched some whacked out video on YouTube and like, well, what are you doing to these children? No, but now because of Greta, this is the great thing about Greta, she has changed the vocabulary. So she has made it possible to talk about catastrophe and collapse and anger, and that's relevant. So in fact, the first video we did in my Climate Academy was, it's time to get angry about climate change. And it was just one student from each section of the school, a Portuguese, a Dutch, in their own language saying, I'm angry about climate change. That was the video. It was just 2 minutes, but they faced the camera and said, I'm angry. But at the time, that was kind of a slightly weird video. And today would just seem like a normal kind of Greta video. But you're right. I agree that it's a funny space to live in, but I think the Greta effect has made it much more, it's normalized it in a way for a student, so it feels better.
Yeah, so it's in the open. They recognize it now. They're being taken serious, which I think is really a big step forward. Now, could you see it going to a level where it may actually spin out of control, right? So you're saying you're supporting them and voicing their angriness, which I fully understand. But it might go too far because they don't have the same kind of life experience and appreciation, perhaps, for structure.
Yeah, sure.
And so, are we looking from evolution to revolution, really?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the first thing to say is that it has to be a revolution. If you look at the science data, there's no time for evolution.
Right.
We've had 30 years of small individual actions. We've had 30 years of sort of gradual reforms, etc. And there's no time left. So the fundamental answer is that it has to be a social revolution now at every level, because otherwise ecology will take over and we will have a revolution which is chaotic, because nature will make it chaotic, because it would just be a collapse of all the systems. So now I agree that for a child, for a young person, that's very difficult to manage, that kind of thinking. So this is one of the kind of twilight zones about working with young people, where how far do you show them the truth? How far do you show how imminent these tipping points are in the science? And that takes a lot of attention. So the groups I've worked with have always been quite small groups of 10 or 12, because you have to manage all these sorts of things. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to the science, that if you give them a rock solid basis for the science and you show them the CO2 graphs, the Keeling curve, and you keep them safely within the scientific models, that gives them a sense of like proportion and perspective, where you don't undermine the severity of it, but you also don't allow them to fall into kind of catastrophism and like, you know, it's all finished and so on. So I think that's the thing which holds it. But of course, we live in times now like Black Lives Matter and that sort of, you know, we live in times where there is such turbulence, because these systemic problems have not been dealt with before. So we're heading into social tipping points, whether we like it or not. So that's, again, going back to what I said about autonomy, giving children this tools to think for themselves and take these kind of stable, autonomous responses as much as you can as a 17-year-old, but don't underestimate them. You know, they are capable.
Well, clearly, I think we've seen that in the news. You mentioned Greta and the power of one. If we were to take a step back and look at what's happening, how would you assess the impact the young have been having on this debate? And from that point, what kind of role do you actually see if you feel that we need to do more as a society? How could you see, first of all, do you assess the current impact of the young? And second, how do you see that evolve?
Well, the greater effect has been remarkable. So that's opened up space, for example, the Green Deal. I don't think that would have been possible. It was inconceivable 2 years ago. But I think the other danger that we have now in terms of trying to define the role of the young people is that they will naturally take it on themselves. And I think one of the things we have to avoid is giving young people the burden of having these individual responses. So of course it's great that you're vegan, or it's great that you fly less, or whatever. Those are all, of course, fantastic, beautiful responses to life and the problem. But of course, it's easy to amplify those things and to take the burden of saving the planet onto your own shoulders. And it's ineffective. I mean, the COVID crisis shows that even when you just slam down on individual consumption, the structure of our embedded emissions in the structures of our life show that individual actions have not enough traction. So I think the role of the young people now is simply to demand change at a systemic level. And the only way I think that you can achieve systemic change is through laws. Laws are like the binding fabric of a society. Just like Martin Luther King protested, he didn't protest for kind of the odd cafe to be a bit more, welcoming for black people. He demanded laws at a system level, at a national level, all the way through. And I think that's the focus that's missing in the current strike movement. That, okay, we're now on the streets, we're now asking for things, but we're not asking for simple systemic change through law.
Yes, a very good point. Thank you for that. I mean, of course, we now have the European Green Deal, and there will be a legal framework. But, what is it then they can ask for specifically? You talk about the law. What kind of law are you looking for? And what kind of, what is it that they need?
Yeah. Well, there has to be a central law hub for all laws about climate that are based on science. And the science is clear. It has been clear for a long time that there's a carbon budget remaining. And that carbon budget has to be divided. If, we all share one atmosphere, we're all equal under the sky, it's only fair that that remaining carbon budget is divided per capita. Now, when you take that per capita number and then allocate it to each individual nation, you end up with a fair amount for each nation to reduce its emissions. So the law has to be science-based, has to be governed by this carbon budget, and it has to be divided fairly. So the national law should be a per capita number. And our project, in fact, has the number for each nation. So Belgium, for example, must cut its emissions by 14% per year starting from now. That's what it turns out. That's what it translates into. So that's the central law. And then around that central law, that central binding commitment, you then have all the subsidiary laws which make sure that that 14% is happening. Our Climate Academy, that's our central project, in fact, to take the students away from this kind of self-negation or this self, like it's my job to save the world, and put it on the shoulders of things like the Green Deal.
Right. So what you're saying is it would be helpful for young to continue, of course, to put pressure on governments, to protest, to make it clear that politicians need to take responsibility. But what you're saying is you would want them to be more specific in their demands rather than just to, call for a bit more recycling, a little bit less flying. You would like them to be more specific about how much they should reduce and how fast. Is that a good summary?
Exactly, yeah. Very good. Because until you have that objective measure of where you're up to, so for Belgium, 14%, you don't know if what you're doing is enough. And it's quite easy to feel ecological. I mean, I guess if you ask most people what's the most ecological country in the world, they might say Norway, because it's like quite pretty and they've got lots of electric cars or something. But Norway's got a huge carbon footprint. I mean, an ecological country would be a developing nation. So because their carbon footprint is much lower. So yeah, this would be like a standard measure for all nations to just to indicate where they're up to. And I think it's kind of absurd that you go to The Economist, and in The Economist you have all this data, the gold, price of gold, Brent crude, etc. But we don't have one for the fundamental barometer of life on Earth. We don't have what do we need globally for this carbon budget and for each nation.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Now, just to understand a little bit better, when you say 14% for Belgium, how does that compare to their current ambitions or the current plans?
Yeah, so no country issues its promises on this basis. They just do it on a political kind of convenience. So they would make their targets relative to the year 1990, and they say we can make our emissions reductions by this year in the future. So there's almost no point of comparison with you. It's almost impossible to compare what they're currently promising and what needs to happen. The way in which you could measure the current commitments globally, you could say as a broad summary that we're on course for about 4 degrees C by the end of the century.
Right.
And 4 degrees C in a human being is called hyperparexia, and that's almost instant death. As a biological system, you can't tolerate that. Even 2 degrees, you feel like you have a bad flu, you stay in bed. So that's where we're up to. If you add up all the commitments, we're still on track for 4 degrees, and that's not acceptable. So this, by doing it per capita, by doing it per nation, you get a kind of reasonable sense of where things are up to. And Belgium is way behind. And in fact, most nations in Europe are still not decreasing their overall emissions. I mean,
right, which is incredible.
Which is amazing. We're still going up. I mean, COVID may change that, but still we're only accelerating. But we don't know that. And people on the streets may see solar panels and like, ooh. But until you have this fixed, clear number to measure it by, it's easy to get the impression that we're decelerating or that we're putting the brakes on. Right. We're not.
Well, if I were to understand that a bit better, so when you say we actually need to decrease emissions by 14% in Belgium, and what would be the storyline that you would present to children, for instance, in school? Like, what is required? What does a world look like where we cut emissions by 14%? Could you describe that?
Yeah. Well, let's take the example of transport. And let's imagine that transport was 14% of Belgium's emissions. That would mean that in 1 year, the whole transport sector would have to be carbon neutral. That's the size of it. And that's not a million miles away from what it is. So then the next year you have to do it again, but this time with another sector. So that's the size of the change that we're looking at. Now, of course, the transport industry is not going to be very happy if they're picked out first. And then nobody is. So then you say, okay, let's have 10 of you in a room. Between the 10 of you, you've got to do it in 10 years. Yeah. So get on with it. So that's the kind of way in which it looks. That's the power of having this number for any one country. Kind of gives them a visualization, if you like, of what it actually looks like.
And when you discuss this with young people, how do they respond, and what kind of perspective do they have? What kind of life would they be leading, and how appealing is that to them?
I think young people are very willing to give up stuff. I think, like my children, they go on scout camps, and like kind of this Belgian ritual. All the 2 weeks in July, your children disappear in a field. Yeah. They love it. I go and pick them up, and I'm like, wow. Okay, you survived, but they love it. They don't, and I think it's the adults that are not prepared to give up their comforts and so actually they're quite prepared to see the world in a different shape. And what they find stressful is the fact that they don't see adults willing to like just face reality. That's the thing that really makes them stressed, not the idea that they would have to live, a more simple life.
And I wonder, from an internal perspective, what is it that they would need, to transition? You talk about philosophy, perhaps other practices. What do you think is helpful for them as we transition as a society, and for the young in particular?
Well, again, I'm going to sort of pick you up on the fact that you keep asking about what do they have to do the check. It's actually the adults that have to do the check. But anyway, let's not fight about that. Okay. But the transition has to be simply, there's no other way around it. This has to be worked out at a very high level in terms of laws and in terms of big infrastructure decisions. That's what it looks like. Yeah. I mean, after that, in a way, you don't want to burden a young person with, well, you had one piece of meat this month. I mean, it's... Yeah. But the whole narrative has to switch to law and to system change.
Right. Well, very clear. Thank you.
And don't ask me again.
Fair enough. Well, anyway, thank you so much. Where can we learn more about your initiatives? Because you have several initiatives. You also wrote a book, Common Sense, or No Common Sense, rather.
Yeah, No Common Sense, man.
Right. And this is a book you work with in schools. I read it. It's beautiful. It's very well illustrated. It makes the points very clear. It's very accessible in a non-childish way. So where can we find the book? Where can we find more about your initiative, Cut 11%?
Yeah. So as a philosophy teacher, my classroom door is open now. So with that book, No Common Sense, because... it's an attempt to make philosophy explain the current situation with climate change, and the first chapter is all the science. And that book, in a way, is a bit of a textbook for the students in my Climate Academy. So we have a Climate Academy in school, which is hopefully we're in the process of expanding into all the different European schools. And but that's kind of in a way the Climate Academy is something just for the students in our school. What's accessible to everybody is the book No Common Sense. You can get that in Waterstones in Brussels or through Amazon. I know.
Okay.
And the Cut 11% we have a website, and that's just cut11%.org. And there you can find your nation. You should look at whatever nation anybody's from. We have in there what is required for 1.5C and what's required for 2C. And next time you go in the streets, take that number with you.
Very good. Super. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think this is a wonderful close. Thanks so much for coming and for sharing your insights. And I look forward to continued conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Cheers. Bye. Reflecting on the conversation with Matthew and the question of evolution or revolution, I think Matthew has been very clear on the need for a much, much stronger response. Evolution has simply not delivered. Revolution, in the sense of radically changing the way we consume and produce, seems to be the only logical and truthful conclusion. And from that reasoning emerges the similarity between philosophy, youth, and a sense of telling it like it is that we adults have become so uncomfortable with. As Matthew says, children are triggered by a gap between words and actions. It's not only that their future is made extraordinarily difficult by the current and past generation of adults, but the fact that the current generation of adults is doing so little about it. This is what frustrates them and brings them on the streets. So it all starts with coming clean and acknowledge this dishonesty, and then be consistent and focus on systemic action to work as fast as we can on radically transforming our society and to give children at least some perspective of a future. And yes, we need to do our bit at the individual level. Fly less, eat less meat, and recycle. But that can't be our main focus, because then we all put it back on the shoulders of the young, whereas we should be supporting them in demanding systemic change, new laws and regulations, and cooperation at the international level. But how? How can we get systemic change through legislation to happen fast enough and at a scale that is meaningful? Well, join us next week as the inquiry continues and I interview Bernd Biervert from the European Commission and ask him whether the recently adopted European Green Deal is the systemic change that we need so badly. So subscribe to the Inner Green Deal podcast and continue to hear about the struggles, the insights, and the inspiration of those on the front line of climate action. Thank you for listening and take care.